Hello, everyone. I'm Therese Bottomly, editor of the Oregonian and OregonLive. This is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Today, I'm talking once again to Zane Sparling, the reporter behind the hit podcast Happily Never After. Zane joined me once before on Beat Check, but he recently answered questions from the community about his podcast on Reddit. I thought the insights were interesting and learned some new things myself, and so I invited him back. Zane, welcome back to Beat Check.
Therese, thank you. Now that I'm a star podcaster, I'm having my chauffeur and butler answer the questions over on Reddit, but I'm happy to summarize what Jeeves told me.
Okay, well, I think I detected the trademark Zane Sparling in the answer. So I think you were really the one behind the Redditor. So Reddit, for those who are not familiar, is a social media platform where readers and users can join in and have conversations. Zane did what's known as an Ask Me Anything, where he has to sort of prove that he is who he says he is, and then people can ask him as the authority anything they want on any subject. And so Reddit users did have questions about the podcast, and they said they really enjoyed it. But I'm going to go through some of the questions, and Zane's going to answer them for us. And again, Happily Never After was the podcast at 6 episodes and then a bonus episode about Portland murder, Nancy Crampton Brophy, who was convicted of killing her husband. And the podcast takes listeners through the initial investigation, through the trial, and to the conviction of Nancy Brophy, who is now serving her sentence in prison. So she was a romance novelist who famously wrote an essay called How to Murder Your Husband, which came back to haunt her in said trial. So first question was, which Nancy Brophy novel is your personal favorite and why?
Well, Therese, this was a interesting question to answer since I don't really approach Nancy's oeuvre from the perspective of favorite. That's sort of like asking what's your favorite form of literary torture, but it was certainly interesting to read these books. I think what I gained from them was trying to reveal Nancy's psychology and how she ticks. I don't know that we can 100% claim that the author is revealed in the books, but there are a lot of similarities. Of course, if you've listened to Happily Never After, you've heard that we used The Wrong Hero, one of her books, as the frame, and there are excerpts embedded throughout the series. I read all the books, so did one of the producers, just to see which ones, and we played around with using excerpts from multiple books, but we ultimately found that that might be a little confusing. The Wrong Cop was the one that I enjoyed because the main character is a caterer, just like Nancy was for many years and was actually relatively successful at that job, unlike her second career as a novelist. It was interesting to see how, despite her protestations, Nancy clearly was cribbing from her own life and knew and described catering in this novel. But my favorite book, naturally, I had to go with an obscure deep cut from 2014, which is called Plotting Your Story Arc, Workbook for Fiction Writers, Plotters, and Pantsers. And for those who don't know, plotting and pantsing are the two different modes of novel writing. Plotters, of course, map out their story in advance, while Seat of the Pantsers write without knowing their ending. And Nancy was infamously a pantser, which you could see in her perhaps not thinking through the what would happen after she committed the murder and how would she avoid getting caught. But this was really my favorite book because it reveals Nancy's chutzpah, right? Her audaciousness, because she writes this book in 2014 and she has the audacity to claim that she's going to be a writing coach, despite the fact that she's never written a successful novel herself. So that was, I thought that said a lot about her character.
Somewhat revealing, indeed.
Yeah, and it also showed that because there's good money to be made, there's actually probably better money for most people to be made teaching writing than selling books. You can host literary workshops. I think that was Nancy's intention with this workbook. She wasn't successful, but it showed how Nancy was, I think, really more interested in monetizing her her work than she was in the craft.
So yeah, you had to pore over the books. The prosecutors pored over the books trying to find clues. Yeah. So from all of this, one of the Reddit Ask Me Anything folks, Magos, said, do you have a theory on the why behind her wanting her husband dead? Because there was this outward portrayal of them as being quite a happy couple.
Yeah, the why. Why did she do it? I think we're all searching. We all wanted that deep answer, and we didn't get it. We got a rather obvious answer in this case. It was the money, right? Nancy wanted that $800,000 she stood to gain from the life insurance policies. If she divorced Dan, of course, she wouldn't have gotten any of that. She would have had to. She'd put a lot of money into paying those policies off every month, and she wanted to make that money back many times over. Of course, if there'd been a divorce, they could have sold the home, but they would have had to split whatever they got. They hadn't paid off the mortgage, and the home did end up selling for about $565,000, $565K in 2019. At this point, Nancy's been arrested, right? But if she had not been arrested, and if Dan is out of the picture, she gets all of that money rather than half of it minus the mortgage. And I think the prosecutor, Sean Overstreet, in this case was correct when he told the jury that it wasn't just money for money's sake. It was the lifestyle. It was the financial freedom. It was the ability to have that independence, because Nancy, of course, truly imagined that she was going to be this carefree expat crafting beautiful sentences on some sun-kissed beach. And that freedom, that financial freedom, I think is what Nancy wanted. You can see it in all of her books. The characters are always facing a genuine oppressor and obstacles that they need to be freed from. That's in fiction. In reality, Nancy, of course, didn't have to kill her husband. A divorce wouldn't have given her as much money as she wanted, but she wouldn't have ended up homeless. She could have found a job, at a grocery store, or moved back in with her family at Texas, or done any number of things. I know it's frustrating for me that Nancy has never confessed. I've reached out to her many times, and I think that she should have Raskolnikov at the end of Crime and Punishment. I think she would feel a little bit better if she came clean, but she doesn't want to.
I think you said during your reporting that there were times that they were even behind on the mortgage, but she would still maintain these multiple insurance policies that she had out on her husband. So
that's right.
Yeah, not a good look when a murder has occurred and the spouse has a lot of life insurance policies. So did anyone, Boho PDX asked, did anyone get Dan Brophy's life insurance policies at the end of the day? Did they pay out?
Not to disappoint Mr. Boho, but no, there's no payout when you are found guilty of murdering the person you've insured, right? The life insurance policies have all read Nancy Drew books, and they are well aware that this is a relatively common scheme as far as murders go. And they have specifically designed their policies that if you are found guilty of killing the person you've insured, that you don't get the money. There was some workers' comp, right? Because if you are murdered on the job, that's considered an on-the-job side injury. And Nancy was already collecting that workers' comp policy. I think it was only about a couple thousand, maybe the policy might have been 40,000. I don't remember the specifics right now, but it wasn't anywhere close to the $1 million she hoped to collect from the life insurance. There was an estate, right? Nathaniel Stillwater, Dan Brophy's son, he did sue Nancy, his stepmother, right after she's arrested for murder. That lawsuit was eventually wrapped up in 2023, and it basically divided Dan's estate, what was left over from the home sale and his possessions, and most of it went to Nathaniel Stillwater. I think it was around $80,000 minus attorney's fees.
And the podcast Happily Never After, was in partnership with Wondery, a very experienced podcast producer. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. And at one point was number one on Apple Podcasts in the true crime list for sure. But this reader said, I've heard this story, but not of your podcast. I'll definitely put it on my list. So again, you can go anywhere to find your podcasts and search for Happily Never After. But their question was, do you feel that meeting Nancy as a new widow, as opposed to a suspected murderer affected how you perceived the story or the situation originally? Did you notice a change as you investigated?
Yeah, there was a huge change. I mean, 2018. I was not a baby journalist, but I was certainly, I mean, it was 6 years ago, so I had 6 years less experience. I had covered vigils before, but I hadn't done as many as I've done now. So I'm going into this. I don't know these people. I don't know the Oregon Culinary Institute. Nancy is this woman in, dressed like a widow in mourning. She's wearing an all black. She's surrounded by people I would later learn were the president and the people in charge of OCI, the Culinary Institute. They were very protective of her because there was not only myself, but camera operators, right? There was other media there, even some plainclothes detectives taking photos of us that we didn't know at the time. And they were kind of, trying to give her a buffer, right? Because this was hundreds of people in a parking lot on a Monday night. And I wrote the story, got part of Nancy's speech, but wasn't able to approach her and actually talk to her one-on-one. I heard what she briefly said to the crowd. Went home, wrote my story, and thought, geez, what a weird thing. This guy seemed like a beloved chef, and his wife is very sad, and wrote my story. And I certainly wasn't thinking that there'd been any sort of, that I'd just been face to face with the murderer. So when I learned that Nancy had been arrested, it was not something I saw coming. And as the case finally got to trial years later, it was a very big shift from this, man, I'm at a vigil and I feel bad for these people. I want to be respectful of people in grief and, but also capture what happens and write an accurate article, to I'm at a trial and the evidence is damning.
And the detectives talked about that too. The Portland police detectives, this grandmotherly figure, wearing a sweater set, that her, snow white hair, and, just they had to kind of come to terms with where the evidence was taking them as well.
Yeah, it should have said step 1 in the essay, wear a cardigan if you want to get away with murder.
So Snowy Days says, I just finished your podcast. It was great. My question is, was it shocking to you that Nancy actually thought she'd get away with murdering her husband?
I mean, by the time I was familiar with the case, it was shocking isn't the right term. It's odd because I think, when you see all the evidence, you're like, what were you thinking, Nancy? I mean, I do think, though, that what this, my response on Reddit is basically like, I'm a jaded journalist and nothing surprises me anymore because I'm such a hard-boiled true crime reporter. But I think what the Redditor was getting at, and what I maybe should have answered, was that there were a lot of things that Nancy and I think the general public, and not even myself, knew going into this, right? Like, most people who have ridden on the TriMet system or have ridden a bus know that there are cameras at the stations, right? Especially on the Max. Nancy didn't know that. So she didn't know that she'd be caught on that video. What I think a lot of us don't know is that, okay, you're walking around a street which has businesses on the street. If you go inside that storefront, there are probably cameras inside, but you would assume that you are not on camera if you can't see one outside. But in reality, if there's a camera pointed through the glass doors of a storefront, like at the pizza parlor that's right by Oregon Culinary Institute, you will be caught on camera. So Nancy, though she had gone and scouted out and looked for cameras, didn't realize that there were cameras inside buildings that could see through windows and record what's happening on the street. And so that, I think, is the part that Nancy, when we talk about Nancy thinking she's going to get away with it, that's where the shock value comes from. Because we really don't, even people like Nancy who were smart enough to not bring their cell phone while doing a crime, they don't necessarily know how much we are now surveilled by electronic eyes.
And certainly, I think inmates in jails know that their calls are being recorded, but for whatever reason, that seems to be a time-honored investigative technique to pull those calls and learn some interesting things about people's demeanor and their attitude.
I mean, she needed that lifeline to her friends who, for inexplicable reasons, really stuck with her for all those years, even as more and more evidence started to trickle out. And it's hard to stop talking, I guess.
Well, speaking of that, one Redditor said I listened to the podcast. It's really good. She has that superficial charm and the glibness. Did you ever catch any warning signs of a dark side? And this is where they think you're in her writing group. So what do we know about the dark side and whether there were ever glimmers of that over the years?
Yeah, this Redditor thought that I was Heidi Trethaway, the host whose voice you'll hear on the podcast. Now, I can reveal exclusively that I am not, in fact, Heidi. I was the reporter, and I had the role of, doing these interviews and going behind the scenes and reviewing all the public records, but I'm not the host of the podcast. So that Redditor was a little confused. But yeah, the glibness, the pathologizing. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not going to diagnose someone from afar. I don't know what Nancy's medical history is. I do know that it is very common in Oregon for someone to be arrested of a crime, and then there are questions about their mental competency, and that person might be found unfit to stand trial, and they have to go to the state hospital, and then they get on medication, then they are able to assist, and they come back, and then they stand trial. Nothing like this ever happened with the Nancy Brophy case. I mean, Nancy was never, deemed a mental health or a mentally incompetent person, right? Now you talk about having some sort of psychopathy. I think that, she wasn't a compulsive liar. Like, there are some people out there, maybe you've met one, hopefully not, right? Where they lie all the time. They lie even when they know they're going to get caught. Nancy wasn't like that. I mean, she lied, she deceived people, but she actually was very good at deceiving people, and she didn't just do it even when the lie would be obvious. She was pretty strategic. So I think that is something that she, again, was she a manipulator? Yes, she was. I don't know if she probably doesn't think of herself that way. Most people don't. She probably just thinks that she's, doing what's best for everyone which coincidentally is what she wants. But yes, she certainly had a very manipulative tendency.
And on the issue of not being able to be quiet, she did take the stand famously, and not a lot of murder defendants take the stand in their own trial. But the question from Reddit was, why didn't Nancy's lawyers keep her from talking so much on the stand? Do you think she's driving her fellow inmates crazy talking about it?
Yeah, and this Reddit question definitely wasn't posed by my dad, who created a Reddit account for the first time ever just to ask this question on the AMA. So this was a complete stranger I'd never met asking this question. Well, again, Nancy's lawyers are the ones who really know what strategy they wanted to do, and they didn't participate in the podcast, so we can't get their perspective. I think that, Therese, as you said, yeah, there are plenty of murder trials where the state, goes on for days and days, calling witnesses, presenting evidence. And then when it's the defense's turn, they say, we rest. And they call no witnesses, they present no evidence. And then they go to the jury and they say, look, there's just not enough. There's reasonable doubt because the state didn't show you enough evidence. And that's all I need to do is say the burden of proof has not been met. This wasn't one of those cases, right? There was tons of evidence. It was circumstantial, but there was a lot of it. So I think that Nancy's defense team had no choice but to call her, right? Because you need these questions answered, right? You need to know, why is she at the crime scene at the exact time this murder is taking place? And then why doesn't she disclose that to the detectives? If Nancy had been really cunning, she probably would have told the detectives, oh, sure, I was at Dan's place earlier this morning, but that was just because he forgot his cell phone and I need to come bring it to him, or he forgot his wallet, right? If she had said something like that, maybe she wouldn't have needed to take the stand. But she had lied. She'd been caught on tape lying, and the jury wanted to hear her side of the story. They wanted to hear an explanation for all of those inconsistencies that the state had highlighted. So Nancy had to take the stand. I think the defense, in hindsight, maybe the attorneys are thinking they should have cut Nancy off a few times or told her to wrap it up and not go down all these rabbit holes. But, you don't want... you're under the scrutiny of the jury, and you don't want to act like anything is going wrong. So it's kind of like a play, right? The show must go on, and maybe they didn't in the moment feel they could tell Nancy to just zip it.
Probably didn't want to look like they were hiding anything or trying to cut her off to, Yeah, I mean, she had a very good defense team, very experienced lawyers.
Yes.
So, yeah. So with that, I think we'll call it a wrap. Again, Happily Never After, reported by Zane Sparling of the Oregonian OregonLive in partnership with Wondery, really has done terrific numbers in terms of audience in the true crime podcast arena. Lots and lots, thousands of people listening to the story and enjoying your good work. So thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Tell a friend, help spread the word. And the best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time,